Yes, we could use a clicker. Well, you're a transporter of the clicker. Here we go. Here it goes. I'm very excited about the next talk as well. We have Tiffani with us today, and Tiffani is the host of Remotely Curious podcast and also executive editorial director at Dropbox. She also is a meditation teacher. We'll have to talk about that. Tiffani, come on stage. I don't feel shy. So wonderful to have you here with us. Oh, everybody, applause for Tiffani. Right? And we're living in this world where many projects or many companies are remote first. Some are partially remote. And so how do you actually launch a project? How do you design a project? How do you work on the project all remotely? So that's what Tiffani is going to speak about as well. But I know a couple of things about you, Tiffani. You like pickles.
Yeah.
A lot.
A lot.
Like.
The most.
So this is just a.
This is heaven.
Yeah, so it's a habit, all right? And also, you speak a handful of 1,000 dialects because you went to 10 schools between the age of 5 and 18. 10 different schools.
Yeah.
So can you, how does it work? Can you just fluently and comfortably switch from one dialect to another?
Only the American South dialects.
Right.
Those I've got pretty good. There's Southern Indiana is a little hard for me, but the rest I can kind of get.
So can it be just like you could say, well, based on the audience and how they behave, I'm going to kind of choose one of the dialects and just go with it, or do you have...
I wish I were that smart, but I think it's more whatever dialect they speak it to me in,
right.
I might choose to speak to them the same one. But you can kind of tell the way they're moving.
That's a magical skill right there. Well, all right, I'll leave it to you. So everyone, please give a round of applause to Tiffani.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm just going to figure this clicker out here for a minute. Oh, maybe. Hold on, let me just see. No. Sorry.
Does it work?
1 second. I'll just hit play. Let's see if it works. No. Okay.
No.
Anybody have any suggestions? If I point it harder, does that work? No.
I used to think that it's going to work in the past, but it didn't.
Oh. Spacebar?
Oh, maybe, yes.
Blow on the cartridge?
Yes.
Oh, I'll just press the good old spacebar. Thank you. Okay, I'll just do that. That'll be fine. Yes, thank you all so much for coming. It's nice to see you all. Vitaly did a great job of introducing my name and my love of pickles. To add to that, I'll just say, I'm an editorial director. I've been leading UX writing, we call them now content design teams, and brand teams, and other types of creative teams for, I guess it's been maybe 15 years now. So it's been a while. But most recently, I've been focused on the Remotely Curious podcast, where I interview researchers and comedians and scholars about the weird world of remote work and kind of the science behind, or the emerging science behind how to do it. We talk a lot about, I talked to the guy who invented the term Zoom fatigue, for example, about why staring at yourself on a screen all day can give you a bit of dysmorphia around what you look like. So things like that. And through that process of talking to experts, but also just doing it and bumbling around in remote work for the last few years, I thought this might be a good time to talk a little bit about it. So that's what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover designing projects remotely. And to begin, I should mention that this isn't going to be like a hyper-technical talk about the tools that you can use to work remotely. And the reason for that is twofold. One reason is just that there are no tried and true tools for doing this yet, that at least none that I know any more than you. And the other reason for that is that there isn't just a playbook for how to engage in remote work in general. It's something that we're all kind of figuring out together. So I thought that would be an interesting place to start, to just kind of explore it the way we've all been doing for the past 2 years. I also think that this group of people, as designers and design thinkers, I think you just bring some really interesting skills to the table when it comes to thinking about how work works. So first, though, some background on this whole topic. So like pretty much everyone else, when the pandemic hit in 2020, overnight, Dropbox started to work remote. And we went from what I would describe as a hyper collaborative, super social, in the office kind of a place to calling in from our kitchen tables and our kids' bedrooms and everywhere else that all of you were calling in from too. And I put this out just to show you, like, this was the Dropbox office. It was legitimately, that pink carpet is a library. It was legitimately one of the most beautiful rooms I'd ever been in. And we went from that to kind of, I don't know if you've all seen the Apple commercial when we all first started to work remotely, but just this like sloppy time of trying to figure it out. And Dropbox being Dropbox, our tech team put a lot of energy into making sure that we had the tools that we needed to succeed in remote work, but naturally, we, along the way, noticed all kinds of other challenges that we hadn't anticipated, and that led us down a path of just rapid experimentation, probably similar to what you've all been going through in the last few years. And so that's what I'm going to talk about with you today. I'm just going to talk about what we've learned, and I'll go ahead and just say what I'm going to say, which is what I personally have come to is that when it comes to working remotely, if you want to produce beautiful or useful work without burning yourself or your teams out, then designing how you work is almost important as designing the work itself. And that's something that I personally have come to. I used to be the kind of person who, like my softball coach growing up, would joke that I was always throwing out my arm. I was always throwing way too hard, way too hard. And so there is a way that remote work can accidentally make us throw too hard. And so when we design the how and not just the what, there is kind of a way that we become a little bit more elegant in how we do things, and we can still get good work done. So that's the theory, at least. So for the rest of our time together, I'm going to unpack what I mean by that, and I'm also going to offer our best available tools and research for how you can meet some of those challenges too. So I'm just going to jump right into it. The first big design challenge I'd say that we face in remote work is around meetings, which sounds so basic, but it is so important. I call this, manage your meetings or they will manage you. And one thing we noticed in the beginning of the pandemic, maybe you noticed it too, was that meetings really started to proliferate. It was like we would schedule a meeting, and then a meeting about the meeting, and a meeting to plan the meeting, and then a meeting to talk about the planning of the planning, and a social meeting to come down from all of that, and it was so much. And my instinct, although I haven't read all the science behind this yet, my instinct is that there was a little bit of fear and a little bit of loneliness behind that. Some people told us at work, many people told us at work that they were afraid, like, if I'm not in meetings and people don't see me, do I exist? And they're kind of afraid of that. And then the other thing is that I'm more introverted, but my extroverted friends were completely desperate for social contact. And so there was a little bit of that going on there. And Dropbox has always been pretty good, I think, about respecting people's boundaries about remote work. I've worked at a lot of tech companies, and Dropbox stands out to me kind of uniquely as, we're not going to overburn you too much. But when we suddenly couldn't swivel our chairs around and talk to each other, tap each other on the shoulders, things just got a little bananas for a while. And like I said, we started to schedule meetings in a way that I think was encroaching on people's free time, on their family time, on their focus time. And we're kind of a company that cares about well-being a lot, and that wasn't going to fly. So thing is, it turns out, for better or worse, that we were not alone in that. This is a stat from a study from a US-based site called Bloomberg. It sounds a little bombastic, but I've heard even more bombastic versions of this, that useless meetings waste time and $100 million a year. I can't remember. I think that's 355 million ILS, something like that. It's a lot of money. But people say that they don't need to go to nearly a third of the meetings that they're invited to. I've heard that number actually is more like 60% at some places. So, we knew from research and also just from our common sense that a culture with lots of unnecessary meetings is a culture that accidentally can contribute to burnout. So we decided to put a little bit of definition about the how and the why of when we would meet. And we landed on these two solutions after a lot of talking and debate. One is just called async by default. What that means is that instead of knee-jerk trying to schedule a meeting for something, we try to think it out on our own first and use email or some other type of written communication to get that point across. So it's like that's the default versus meeting is the default. And then the other thing we try to do is just to encourage people to only meet for the 3 Ds. That's important discussions, decisions, and debates, versus things like status updates and just checking in. Obviously, anybody can, have a Zoom coffee with whoever they want, but really just trying to clarify and narrow down when do we want to come together and put some intentional design behind that. So the good thing about this, the hard thing about it, is that in order to make it work, we knew we had to make the shift company-wide, not just on a few teams, which was pretty tricky. I don't know if you've ever tried behavior change on a large scale before, or even on a small scale, like if you're trying to cut back on this or that sugar or whatever. So you may know how challenging it can be to get people on board with like a big new way of thinking. And when we first started, there were plenty of people at Dropbox, especially people in what we call high availability roles, like producers and admins, who are naturally very skeptical. Can you imagine being a chief of staff for the CEO and being told, you can only meet between these times and these times? So it was a little difficult for some people to adjust. But within a year of the shift, it turned out that 63% of people at Dropbox say they had adopted an async by default mindset, which was notable because it's not just the behavior, but the way of thinking about it, and they were able to describe back to us what it was. And the vast majority said that that process had reduced unnecessary meetings for them. So if you're like most people, or if you're like I was, learning to say no to meetings can be a little bit scary. So if you're still on the fence, know that you're not alone, while potentially considering this stat by the MIT Sloan School of Management that showed that when these 76 big companies tested meeting-free days, they noticed all this positive stuff, which I will just summarize as productivity and satisfaction increased, stress dropped, communication and cooperation improved significantly, and even more heartening potentially just last week, I'm not saying this to promote Dropbox, but I think it's interesting that last week a study came out from Glassdoor that said Dropbox had been voted the #1 company for work-life balance in the States, which is notable because we're a tech company, and tech companies aren't exactly always known for that. So just something that I thought was really fascinating and even more, more surprising than I had imagined. So, design challenge number 2, collaboration. I call this brainstorm in bursts and focus in waves. So when we went remote, in addition to needing to figure out what we would meet about, we needed to think about when we would meet, and most importantly, when we wouldn't. And if you've ever worked with people who live across the world or just across the country, which I'm sure you have living here in Tel Aviv, you probably know how challenging it can be to balance collaboration time with focus time. And to put it simply, when your favorite time to chat is my favorite time to write or design, how do we work that out? And how do we work it out not just for a few people, but for a whole big bunch of people? It's kind of a crazy design question, I think. And at Dropbox, we'd heard a little bit of sort of anecdotal, sort of not research, that working in bursts can be helpful for creative generation and creativity in general. Bursts just means these intense periods where you're basically free to be together and talk and brainstorm and interrupt each other and Slack each other and all of that. So we decided to try a company-wide experiment in burstiness. And we called this core collaboration hours, which they're just these company-wide blocks for synchronous, that's at the same time work. Another easier way to say it is, hey, there are some times when we're just going to go online at the same time. So an example of this is that we may have it where we have these blocks of time from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., I didn't convert that, but you can probably do it, to Israeli Daylight Time. And we all agree to be available to meet then. But outside of that, you don't need to meet. You can say, you know what, this is my focus time, and we try to be flexible with each other, but really to block that time off. And as with our attempts to reduce meeting, getting a whole bunch of thousands of people to do this was fairly challenging. Let's say, for example, you're a person like me who prefers to focus in the morning, but suddenly all your meetings happen then, and you're kind of like reworking your phenotype or whatever you call it. You're reworking your way of working. So we had to kind of massage that and get through that. But we found that by the end of the year of last year, that 81% of people at the company say they had adopted core collaboration hours, and that over 3/4 of them, which again, this surprised me, felt more productive and more effective and more able to balance their work and personal life. So it turned out that this mass sort of healthy boundary setting, but also kind of a radical thing. I don't know what your culture where you work is like, but where I've been working the last 15 years, it's kind of radical to have the whole company agree to these boundaries. So I just thought that was interesting. Yeah, and the other thing I will just say on a personal note is that as we did this, I found I had more creative energy, and I don't think I would have been able to, for example, make a whole podcast on top of my regular workload if we didn't have this structure. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think this graph that I believe Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, he's in the US, had shared, kind of captures this thought really well. Like, we think that what works best is constant contact. It's showing up, butts in seats, being very present, talking. But what actually seems to work best is just these rapid fire bursts. A burst of together focus, a burst of together focus. And it reminds me, although I haven't had science behind this, just reminds me of how an athlete might be taught to do their work. You sprint and break in order to improve. I should also mention there's a new study, if you like this kind of thing, in Nature magazine that points out the actual pitfalls of remote work for creative generation. It's super interesting, very in-depth. I just found it, so I'm happy to share it. So the next, I'll just hint at the next slide. So the next big challenge then is, I'm just going to see if you can see the top. Oh, well, I'll just tell you. So the next big design challenge is just for us was around communication. And the lesson there for us and for me was be clear, concise, centralized, and consistent. If you're a content designer or a UX writer or a designer, this is probably a no-brainer to you. I have been doing content design for so many years, but had to really refresh my memory on that as I started to think more about communicating at a company-wide level. So when we started to make all these big changes, we knew that we would need to be really clear about what we wanted people to do, but it turns out that we needed to be clear in a particular kind of way in order for the behavior change and the ideas to stick, and also in order for people to just kind of feel good about what we were asking them to do. Since you're all familiar with usability best practices, my guess is this is not going to shock you very much. So the first thing we learned was that clear beats corporate. Those two things it's a little bit one of these things is not like the other, but I just summarize it as simple, everyday words that most people could understand work better than hyper-technical words that you have to be a bit of an insider in order to understand. And the reason for that, I'm sure a scholar or a UX usability person could school me on, but I can just say it's a little less intimidating and it's just easier to do stuff when you can understand what somebody's asking you to do. Dropbox actually, bless its heart, has a habit of using corporate language in a big way, and so I had to kind of like ease them out of that. Second thing is just that concise beats comprehensive. Again, in UX writing, that should probably be obvious, but actually there's a whole school of thought, I believe it's the MIT school, that comprehensive is actually better. You should give people everything. But when it comes to behavior change, when you're making the policies, when you're inventing stuff, it can be tempting to try to throw the book at people. But in fact, what works better is something more akin to the design principle of progressive disclosure. Give them the big idea, and then a little bit more information in bites as they learn to do it. And I think this is interesting just that it applies to all kinds of communication. And then centralized beats siloed. This should be obvious. Dropbox is the management company, or the knowledge management company, so you'd think we would have that figured out, but for us, like everybody else, it's very tricky. When the pandemic hit, meetings exploded, also documents exploded, and so we had to double down on, where are we going to put these so that people can find them? And how are we going to make sure that they're updated? And all that content strategy stuff turned out to be important. And then finally, consistent beats cutting edge. This is a bit of a, I don't know, a bummer for me as somebody who likes to make up new ways to say things. But you have probably heard the advertising principle before, that in order for your message to sink in, somebody needs to hear it 100 times. And so we realized that for people to remember even something like the 3Ds, we need to say it over and over and over again in the same way, not just so they would remember it, but so they felt the permission to actually do it. So we kind of learned that the moment that we became tired of what we were saying was the moment that some people at the company were just starting to really have it sink in for them. And then this I also thought was interesting, that this communication challenges apply not just to how you're writing to each other, but to management and leadership as well. So this is a study in the Academy of Management Journal, and it talks about how managers who don't communicate frequently enough with their employees are like 9 times more likely to be perceived as being uncaring or not engaged. And I definitely had this happen to me a little bit when remote work started. I am a bit of an introvert, and so I assume often by accident that people don't want to be interrupted, because I don't always like to be interrupted. But in the office, I could walk by people who reported to me and just smile at them or whatever, get them a cup of coffee, and that was a way of showing engagement and care. And that really went away in remote work. And so we all had to find these other ways, especially leadership had to find these other ways of interrupting well. And so definitely there's a difference between I'm just gonna ping you 10 times a day, which would probably be rough for anybody reporting to you, and then finding a more elegant way of saying, hey, I see you, I know you're here, and there's some good research around that. I don't know how to show you this, but I'll just share it afterwards. At the top, it says the Virtual First Toolkit. We created something called the Virtual First Toolkit, which is a set of sort of very doable written practices to help people make some of these shifts. And one of the big things that we focused on was communication. So teaching people literally how to write an email, all the things that you're all pretty good at probably already from your design training. But we found that we really needed to bolster what we were asking people to do with now, how do you do it, and how do we make it as easy for you as possible? And then design challenge number 4, you can't see the top there, but it is connection. I would say this is almost the biggest one that we've faced at Dropbox. It's definitely the biggest one that I and my friends seem to face. It's also one of the hardest, because deep connection with other people is not something that you can always just mandate from on high. There's a lot of personal work that goes into that sort of a thing. And the solution that I've kind of summarized here is what I just call intend to friend, and I'll get into what that means. We found, like I mentioned, that in surveys and research around remote work, that this was something people were really struggling with. So how do we create a sense of belonging and togetherness in remote work when it's not just happening naturally? And I wish I could say that we have this all figured out, but the truth is, no matter how much time you spend in the metaverse, I talked to the big metaverse scientist about this, or how much time you spend on Zoom, they just simply cannot replace in-person interactions. They just don't. But that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that you have to do a little extra work to feel that sense of connection. This is one reason why we adopted the studio model, so that we're mostly remote, but we have some space that you can come to if you want to do collaborative work with somebody. And the big lessons that we personally learned around this were to invest in weak ties. I'll talk about what that means, and to get serious about small talk. So weak ties, there's a lot of interesting research from Stanford on this. There are these connections you get when you bump into somebody in the hallway, or maybe it's your barista, just somebody you don't know that well, and you just chat with them for a little bit. And many of people, myself included, used to take these kinds of connections for granted before remote work happened. I just barely even noticed them. But it turns out they're crucial for disseminating information, hold on, there's one other really important one that I wanted to tell you. Disseminating information coming up with creative ideas, and just feeling good at work. There's one study that came out that talked about how people who had connected with weak ties a little bit more in the course of their day, like even if it was their yoga teacher they just talked to for a minute, felt happier. And I believe it wasn't just the extroverts who felt that way as well. So knowing that we could not simulate hallway run-ins, we did try to stimulate weak ties a little bit. We tried something called Coffee Box, which to my introverted nature was sort of horrifying, but just like pairs Dropbox employees randomly with other Dropbox employees for coffee. But for a lot of people, this was absolutely wonderful and helped them feel more welcome at work. We tried randomly assigning people to Zoom groups who didn't know each other during big meetings, so they would just have a chance to talk to somebody who they weren't with all day long. And then we adopted this neighborhoods program where if you live in, say, Vancouver, you could invite people in your area to come and connect with you. We don't have much data about that yet, but the short story is just that after doing that I think something like 81% of people said that they felt had made a new connection because of that. And then the second thing is just that to get serious about small talk seems like not a big deal, but those 5 to 10 minutes that you spend at the beginning of a meeting just goofing off, turns out that really matters to people. Remote work can feel remarkably transactional. For many people, you have these meetings, you get your work done, and you just focus. But actually, the guidance is, no, just like let people have a little space around the work, which we thought was really fascinating. And then there's so much, so this is another kit you can't see. It says the Virtual First Teamwork Kit. We even created these little tools to help people recreate water cooler moments. And who knows if those tools are the best tools since sliced bread, but one thing that we know about them is that it gave people the idea that those little bits of wasteful chatter actually can make difference to their happiness. And then I'm going to rush through this research and share most of the rest of it later, but we did interview an amazing researcher named Dr. Marissa Franco, who's a friendship expert, about how to make friends as an adult. And she's where I got the idea of being intentional. It's like amazing that there are friendship experts around here. And she shared some pretty incredible information with us about this. And this is like her process for making friends, deepening your connections in remote work, but just in general too. The one is just to initiate. So if you have the urge to be a friend with somebody, then the number one best thing you can do is reach out to them. That seems pretty straightforward, but for many people it is actually very, very challenging. But initiation is one of the biggest pieces of it. The second is to disclose. So people feel a little bit closer to people who reveal a little bit about themselves personally rather than just sticking to surface level work stuff. This is not to say you need to be raw. I think there's a difference between like rawness and vulnerability or openness. But if you decide that you'd like to be friends with somebody and you'd like to be a little bit closer to them, then showing them a little bit about who you are is a pretty good thing to do. And then this one also, they all seem so straightforward until you read the research, and then it's sort of shocking. The other one is to show affection. So the research sort of resoundingly shows that people tend to like people who they think like them. And so that's just how we're wired. So if you like somebody, or you like something specific about them, or you'd like to be friends with them or connect with them more, it's good to actually just tell them that. It makes a big difference. And then this was one of my very favorite pieces of advice because it gets into some really deep thinking, is to just assume people like you. So this is based on the science of human attachment, which I went down a big rabbit hole about 5 years ago. And the basic idea is that people who grow up with secure attachments to their caregivers tend to assume that their caregivers are going to meet their needs and like them and care about them. Often they go out into the world assuming the same thing about other people. And what's interesting about it is that this can create a virtuous cycle whereby you assume a bit more generosity about others and then you meet them with a bit more generosity yourself. There's also a good deal of research suggesting that a lot of our fears that people don't like us are just unfounded. It's not the way that we think. We often are like, they don't like me as much as I like them. But actually, they're either neutral often or it's not anything that you have anything that you're afraid of. And then the final one is to try repotting friends. That just means that instead of sticking to the same old work context, if you want to be closer to somebody, invite them to be part of your life in some other way, to come to dinner at your house, to meet your family. And there is, oddly and amazingly, a lot of research about this as well. So I busted through that. There's a podcast episode on Remotely Curious with Marissa Franco. Don't tell the other people, but it's my favorite one. And so she really does a much better job than me of outlining this research. The 4 big remote work challenges that we tackled, there are many more: meetings, collaboration, communication, and connection. What we have learned, and what I, as a person who throws my arm out often, have learned, is that there is a real elegance to designing the way that you work in such a way that meets 2 goals, which is helping you to produce amazing work and helping you and the people around you to stay well. So I've talked a lot about how Dropbox, the company, did this, and I happen to enter into that initiative at the level of kind of helping to rethink or rewrite policies and create tools about it. But you don't have to be entering into the discussion at that level to make a difference in the way that you and the people around you feel around work. There's some things in here, as you can tell, that are just very personal things you can do. You could just decide, you know what, I'm going to try to just do my bursty work in these hours and see what happens. And you'd be surprised, I think, how many times when you present a straightforward argument in our company, especially if it's backed by research, can go a long way if you're trying to get something done. Okay. Else? Oh, like I said, sorry, this is all out of alignment there. The podcast where we talk about this research a lot is Remotely Curious. You can check out the Virtual First Toolkit, experience.dropbox.com, virtual/first/toolkit. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tiffani.
Do I keep this?
No, I think that...
I take this off?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, come all over.
Okay.
We have so many questions. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, by the way. There's a lot of points that we'll be discussing next. That's okay. Don't worry, that's okay. That's okay. So I think that, where should I sit now? I always forget. So maybe I was told that it's better for me to sit in here. It's interesting because one of the first questions that came up, and I was kind of expecting it almost, right? We see these big discussions happening on LinkedIn and so on and so forth, like big companies saying, no, enough of remote work already. This is done. We should be moving back to offices. This is the future. And one of the questions that came up almost immediately, are companies returning back to offices now? Will remote work even survive?
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer to it. I know that people from the research I read are pretty desperate for connection, and that there really are some limitations to creative generation and innovation with remote work. And so for those reasons, I'm assuming that people are hungry to get back to the office. Right. And so for some people are. But there are also all of these amazing benefits that remote work confers on people's personal life, on their sense of autonomy, a lot of times, depending on how you design it. And so the way I'm seeing it is different companies adopting different policies and practices at different times, which is a little chaotic. But I'm noticing people say, oh, wait, we were all remote and I was going to go work from Portugal for a month, and wait, now we're hybrid and I can't do that. And so there's a great shift happening. I don't think remote work is over. I mean, I think it's probably here to stay in a lot of ways, but not for everybody and not in the same way.
Yeah, so I also like how you just outlined all the issues that we have to deal with, because in fact, we have all these opportunities and you can be anywhere and all of that, but then I don't think that anybody in this room likes to commute. Anybody enjoys commuting to office?
Trying to find one.
Okay, let's have one person. Yeah, one person. That's okay. We can listen to podcasts, and you'll have a wonderful podcast as well. So but let's have a kind of a vote. I'm just curious. So who would prefer to go all in, full back in the office, 5 days a week?
One person.
One person.
Kind of a maybe.
Who would be like 3-4 days a week? It's okay. So you need 1 day. Okay, who would say, at most 1 day a week in the office? I would say majority. One and a half, whatever that means, right? Okay, so I think that in many ways it's really difficult. I think
Yeah.
what I see, again, just coming back from my experience in Germany, if whenever people see the relocation in the description, this is a turn off.
Oh, interesting.
For many people, it's just, oh, relocation, I don't want to relocate. So
Yeah.
we can meet and we could have this wonderful
Totally, yeah.
kind of gatherings and so on, but relocating, really, is still an important thing.
Yeah.
Because people moved away from the big cities.
Yeah.
Right? And, this, I mean, it's not a question, actually. I should be asking
But,
questions.
it's interesting that you say that because one of the big reasons that a company might decide to do it from just a strategic standpoint is that you can tap into all this other talent that you might not be able to if you force people to relocate for a job at your company, and they have to, maybe they have a lovely family where they live or extended family, they don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've noticed is that it's been a lot easier to hire people in places that, in the States or elsewhere that normally wouldn't be able to work in tech for that very reason. And so I'm talking about like what some people call the flyover states where I'm from, Indiana and Tennessee and those types of places in the United States are getting a little bit more opportunity to work in the industry, which is interesting.
Right. One question that came up here is, how did Dropbox deal with the overflow of the documents?
We're still dealing with it. I don't know who asked the question. It's hard. We had to just have some principles around how we were going to do it, and some discipline. So the biggest thing, oddly, I don't know, these things seem so simple, but they're not, was around company goals and team goals. They were just every place and everywhere, and so we started to track those just using Dropbox and Dropbox Paper and a few other tools so that anybody could find them at any time. And what surprised me about it, but from my content training didn't, was how hard it was for people to remember what the goals were if they didn't go look at them a bunch. And so that made it even more incumbent on us to do it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Just two very short questions. One that came up and somebody's really excited about it, so I have to bring this up. Small talk takes time. Small talk in every meeting takes a lot of time. Where do you draw the line between connecting and wasting time?
I don't know, because on our team, we definitely have people who are internal processors, people like me who think about it before I say it. And then I work with somebody who I adore, who is an external processor. And he says, if it didn't come out of my mouth, I never thought it. So if he's talking, it just goes and goes and goes. And so there's a way that you it's like a social skill thing, I think, or a social grace thing. It's like whoever is holding the space for the meeting, whether informally or formally, I think can do a lot to help to just guide and redirect, but in a gentle way that recognizes that only getting down to business over and over again can be rough on us when we don't see each other.
Right, right. Well, we could speak for hours, I think, because this is something that's, and I really appreciate the fact that you released the virtual kit thing, so this is really great to see as well. But, yeah, if you have any questions to Tiffani, you'll probably be around for a while as well, so feel free to jump in, and I mean, there are so many conversations. We can have an entire conference about remote, Avi? That's a hint right there, maybe. That'd be very interesting just to see how the way we work, we live, socialize, collaborate, and all that has changed, because it's really a massive shift. But please give a very warm round of thank you and applause to Tiffani.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tiffani. All right, I was told that this is a time for dessert. Anybody up for dessert? Not that.